Hey there, Discover Family Church. Pastor Johnny here. Today I want to talk about, I'm reading in Acts today, and in the book of Acts, we hear the story of Stephen. And I've talked about Stephen lots of times, the martyr Stephen. But one of the things that I think we lose is what happens right after Stephen is stoned. So we know the story of Stephen. He's the very first martyr for being a Christian, the very first guy to die for his faith in Jesus. and what we see is the story of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. And then we go to the very first few verses of Acts chapter 8. And for the very first time, you got to understand that this is the very worst incident of persecution that the church has ever seen since Jesus' crucifixion. And it's the very worst persecution you see in the whole entire book of Acts is the stoning of Stephen. And right after that, chapter 7 is the end of the story of Stephen, and then it goes to chapter 8. In chapter 8, listen what it says in verse 1 of chapter 8. Right after, you've just ended, the last verse of chapter 7 says, and falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold their sin against them." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. That was Stephen. So Stephen was stoned. And the very next verse says this, "And Saul approved of his execution. and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made lamentations over him, but Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison." What we see here is the very worst case of persecution that the young church had ever seen. And in the middle of that story, we are introduced to a man who would later go on to be the greatest church planter in history, write 2/3 of the New Testament that we read. We are introduced to a man who would proclaim the gospel of Jesus wider than any person ever had in this early church days. And right there, I'm talking about Saul. It says Saul approved of it. Saul, if you don't know, is the guy who turns into Paul. Saul of Tarsus turns into Paul on his way to Damascus. He finds Jesus, and here we see the glimpse of the radical grace that God shows throughout the entire Bible. We see it so perfectly right here. This incredible grace that starts shining through a guy named Saul. Saul, who approved of the murder of Stephen, who was entering houses and dragging people out and throwing them in prison. God does not leave behind even the worst sinner at the beginning of the church. He's just starting something new, and he doesn't leave behind the very worst sinner that there is. And what we see here is that this story offers hope. It offers hope to all of us who feel unforgivable. It offers hope for all of us that sometimes write people off and say that they're too bad, they're too far gone, they can't experience this grace and love that Jesus has. So often, we assume that somebody is beyond redemption because maybe they've never exhibited a want or a desire for it. Maybe the things they have done to you or have done to other people have been so horrendous. And maybe you yourself have done things that are so terrible that you think that you are beyond the pale. You are so far removed from ever even having the option of grace. And what we see here is the story of the worst persecution, the first martyr being approved by Saul. And within just a few chapters, we see Saul turn into Paul, become a man who spreads the gospel around the known world and sparks off the church that we know today. You are not too far gone, and neither is the person that you think is too far gone. God wants to shine through the life of the worst sinner you know, and maybe that's you. God's grace, God's future, and God's hope doesn't know and doesn't care what you did yesterday. It cares what you're going to do today. And so I encourage you, if you feel like you're too far gone, you're not. And I would love to pray with you. I would love to spend a few minutes talking with you and sharing this love and grace that Jesus gave to Saul. And if you know somebody that you've written off, don't write them off. Remember, God wants to work through even the worst sinners. His grace is big enough for everybody. I love you guys. Have a great day.